Hello and welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm John Bachman. Back with us again is former UN Ambassador under President George W. Bush, John Bolton. Ambassador, as always, it's great to talk with you.
Well, thanks again for having me. Glad to be with you.
All right, I want to focus on your recent op-ed piece in the New York Post, and I'm quoting here. I know you're familiar with this, but some of our viewers might not be. And this is the quote here. Obama sees negotiations as deflecting the threat of Iranian nuclear weapons. Iran sees them, by contrast, as helping to ensure success for that very weapons program. There is simply no compromise between these objectives. There are no bridging proposals that can overcome irreconcilable differences. Beyond whatever specific terms emerge this week in Geneva, the West's efforts to negotiate with Iran are doomed to failure because the parties' objectives are utterly incompatible. A decade of abortive negotiations alone demonstrates this basic truth, which Iran's ongoing diplomatic charm offensive cannot obscure. So, for those folks out there hopeful that something can be done, some sort of solution can be done, and by that I mean reducing or halting Iran's nuclear weapons program, what options does a president have, this president, the next president, other than a military one?
Well, I don't think there are any good options. I think if we had 10 years ago started on a very stringent program of economic sanctions that were universally applied and enforced militarily, then it might be possible that the sanctions could have driven Iran to give up the nuclear weapons program. But that's not going to happen now. The program is too close to its objective of deliverable nuclear weapons. The sanctions have, while they've certainly had a clear effect, have not slowed the nuclear program down at all. So, look, Iran wants relief from the sanctions. I think that's perfectly understandable, but not at the price of giving up their nuclear weapons program. That's why the objectives of the United States and Iran are completely irreconcilable. So Iran sees these negotiations as a way to buy time, to get some relief for the sanctions, and basically continue to make progress on the nuclear program. So they're happy to make superficial concessions. They're happy to string this thing along, because it just leaves them ever closer to their objective.
Now, everyone can understand why the Obama administration is desperate for a deal on this one. They're looking for something to point to for the president's legacy, which, won't be the best based on recent history. But just today, British Foreign Secretary William Hague says a deal is still possible. Why do you think he's optimistic?
Well, I think the fact is that the Europeans who are in this negotiation will follow America's lead. That's why it was so stunning 10 days ago when France put the spoke between the wheel in Geneva and stopped that earlier session from coming to agreement. But I think we're past the point where there's going to be disagreement. I think the odds favor signing something in Geneva tomorrow, the next day perhaps. And I think it's the root cause. You say, well, why is Obama so eager to negotiate? And that's because I think ultimately, although they may say they don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons, the Obama administration believes that you can contain and deter a nuclear Iran as we contained the Soviet Union during the Cold War. I think that's a bad misreading of history, a misreading of the regime in Iran. But what it reflects is that Obama fears an Israeli military strike against Iran's program more than it fears an Iranian nuclear weapon. Now, again, I think that's looking at the world through the wrong end of the telescope, but that's how the Obama team sees it. So they want a deal, they want a negotiating process in place because it will help them pressure Israel against resorting to the military option.
Now, you mentioned the Soviet model of containment, but I've also heard comparisons to the Pakistani model as well, that Iran wants this nuclear weapon, and they see that as really the only viable way to end these sanctions. Do you think that's where the mullahs and the ayatollahs' head is at right now?
Well, I think that's certainly part of it, and I think this is why people underestimate the impact of the changes we'll see in the world once Iran does get a nuclear weapon. Number one, almost certainly, as Secretary of State Clinton said before she left office, if Iran gets nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia will get nuclear weapons, Egypt will, Turkey will, perhaps others, so that in a relatively short period of time, you're going to have half a dozen new nuclear weapon states in the already volatile Middle East. And number two, Iran doesn't have to use the nuclear weapon to be a threat to Israel, to our Arab friends in the region, and to the United States. Let me just give you one example. Iran is also the world's central banker for international terrorism. It is the leading state sponsor of international terrorism. What if it financed, directed, supported a terrorist attack on the United States? We traced it back to Iran, and we're thinking about taking retaliatory action as we did against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda for 9/11. You don't think our calculation wouldn't be a lot different from what happened in 2001 if we knew that Iran, the source of the terrorist attack, had nuclear weapons? The answer is absolutely. So the weapons capability really enhances Iran's ability to resort to terrorist attacks. It doesn't have to use the nuclear weapon in the sense that it doesn't have to detonate the nuclear device in order to take advantage of it.
Well, nobody, they can't really use it, of course. That would ensure their, mutually assured destruction. Going back.
Well, not if they used it against Israel, for example. That is the risk. Or if they used it against Saudi Arabia, or if they gave it to a terrorist who exploded it in an American city, and we couldn't be exactly sure where the weapon had come from. It's one thing when you launch a nuclear weapon on top of a ballistic missile, you can trace the back azimuth of where that missile came from. But if you put a nuclear device in a truck, put it on a tramp steamer, and sailed it into New York Harbor, you could not necessarily say with complete conviction what the origin of that nuclear weapon was.
Yeah, there's a laundry list of nightmare scenarios. Those are just a few. I want to also focus on something the Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei said today, and that is that Iran will not back down, I'm quoting here, one iota from Iran's rights. Do you see any circumstance where Iran would be able to develop a nuclear energy program but not pursue a nuclear weapons program at the same time?
Only if there were a revolution in Iran that got rid of the Ayatollahs. This regime has lied about its nuclear program for over 20 years. It has tried to deceive the international community. The evidence is overwhelming and essentially undisputed outside of Iran that the only purpose of this program from its inception has been a weapons objective. So the notion that you could trust this regime with any aspect of a nuclear program, which President Obama seems fully prepared to do, I think is very dangerous. If you had regime change and the establishment of a new regime which proved its trustworthiness over a period of time, at that point I might be willing to look at something, but not as long as this regime is in power.
Well, the people that would lead that revolution, they're already not exactly happy with President Obama after that revolution failed a few years ago and didn't get much of the president's support. Now, if the Iranian public, the more moderate public, does not believe that these sanctions will ever end and they will only get more difficult, don't they then start to lose some of their effect?
Well, in fact, the sanctions have had the most dramatic effect against the middle class in Iran, which is the element of society most opposed to the regime. So the irony here is that while there's no doubt there's been a significant economic effect, it's actually hurt the part of the Iranian population most inclined to share the view that this regime needs to go. And that's one of the reasons why sanctions ultimately are not going to stop Iran's nuclear weapons program.
All right, well, the last topic I want to talk about, this is changing topics a little bit, is this agreement that was reported yesterday, supposedly between Afghanistan and the United States, and there may or may not have been a portion of that agreement that would have included some sort of public apology from the United States, from President Obama, about the war in Afghanistan over the last 10 years. Susan Rice came out yesterday and firmly denied that. But what's your take on any kind of new Afghani agreement?
Well, look, I think the president basically wants to withdraw from Afghanistan. I think, as he did in the case of Iraq, he's looking for an excuse to get out. So it won't surprise me if these negotiations ultimately break down. And he's basically let the military have its way because they understand that the battle with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan will continue for some time. But that's not where the president's heart is, and so I think he'd be perfectly happy if the negotiations collapse.
All right, so we'll see what happens there. Ambassador John Bolton, thanks for being with us today. As always, a pleasure speaking with you, sir.
Well, thanks again for having me.
And thank you for watching Newsmax TV.